Welcome to our photography workshop. We'll talk about basic photography techniques and a bunch of different photos I've taken over the past few years from different vacations I've been on, different locations that are more close by, some family photos, and definitely some photos of my dog. This very first photo is from a family trip out to Wyoming, and this is actually in Lamar Valley at Yellowstone National Park. So this is where, when you think of seeing the wolves, this is where you would go to see those wolves. It's really beautiful. So you'll see a bunch of photos like this that are pretty amazing. You kind of wouldn't get to take photos like this unless you went out to some place pretty cool like a national park. But then we have some photos that are more normal around town kind of things. So let's get into it. The topics we'll be covering are composition, lighting, themes and content, and a quick run through of storytelling. As we go throughout the photos, there will be some storytelling. So the last portion is really just a quick summary. The very first thing we'll be discussing is composition. So what is composition? Composition is the placement of objects and elements in a certain way that best suits your main idea or goal. So it's a way to guide your viewer's eye towards the most important elements in your photograph. If you're thinking and planning ahead, it really will help make a successful composition. So we'll be talking about things that you can be aware of that you should try to leave in or out of your frame. One of the main things that you can always keep in the back of your head is the rule of thirds. So some of you may have heard about the rule of thirds before, but basically it helps you to plan out your visual weight. It helps you to figure out what the most important thing is in your frame. So the idea of the rule of thirds is that your frame is divided into thirds. So it can be horizontally divided up into thirds, or if your frame was vertical, you could divide it into thirds. So those lines that you see splitting across divides up everything, so you end up having 9 equal rectangles, and where they intersect, that's where the red circle is, that target point. That's a point of interest. So basically you want to place your items of interest on those target points, but you also want to have things like if you have a scene that has a sky and grass, to keep it the most interesting, you want your sky to either take up about 2/3, the top 2/3, and then the grass, the land, would take the bottom third, or perhaps the sky would take up the top third and the land would take the bottom 2/3. That way it's just a little more visually interesting than just having it split right down the middle. We'll see examples of visual weight as we're going through the photos, but basically visual weight is how much something attracts your eye. So it's kind of a hierarchy. You want to think about the things that will pull your eyes in as the audience viewing the photos, what pulls your eyes in first, and that is actually faces, a human face specifically, but it could be any type of face and specifically with eyes. The next in line would be something like size, like something larger in size, color, brighter colors, contrast. The next thing would be if you see writing, maybe a sign with some writing on it. And then the last thing is kind of something of novelty or something that's cute or unique, something interesting. That's generally the hierarchy, the order of things that your eye is searching around for within a photo. One of my family vacations was to Colorado. My uncle was staying in Aspen, so one day we visited this ghost town in Ashcroft, which is right outside of Aspen. So back in the 1880s, people set up a silver mining community, but they left after only 5 to 10 years since not much silver was actually found there. At one point, the town had 2,000 people in it while it was thriving. This is showing the rule of thirds because we see that the grass at the bottom is taking up approximately a third, the sky is the upper 2/3, and we notice that the house is on the left lower power point or point of interest. So your eye goes right to that house. This is another example of the rule of thirds. So you'll see that the horizon line, which is where the sky meets the water or where the sky meets the land. So you'll see that the horizon line is going straight through the center of the photo. But you'll also notice that because there is a nice clear reflection, you'll see that the top third is the sky. The middle section of green, which includes that tree line above the horizon line and below the horizon line as part of the reflection, that takes up about a third. And then the bottom third is the water. So you'll see that divided into thirds on those lines that go across horizontally in your frame. You also notice that the bushes on the left and right side are on the thirds, the left third and the right third. And then you just notice that that kind of burst of sun, it's hidden behind the cloud, but you'll see that that's on the left side in that upper left, kind of close to the point of interest, that intersecting point. This is a photo I took from a hike I went on to Penwood State Park in Simsbury, Connecticut, so not too far away. And it's really beautiful because you get to this point where the water is just so clear. And so on a nice day, you'll see the sky reflecting into the water and it just looks like a mirror image. So definitely worth the hike. We're back in Wyoming. This is a view from Inspiration Point overlooking Jenny Lake at the Grand Tetons in Wyoming. So there was morning sun. It was about 9 a.m. And you'll see on the right side, you'll see the sun reflecting in the water. And the position that I took the photo in, you'll see that the rule of thirds is in play here. The reflection of the sun is on that right third dividing line, and you'll notice that the mountains on the left side, that's taking up approximately 2/3 of the frame, and then on the right side, kind of in the more of the right third area is where the water and the sky is. So you'll see that it's not an exact measurement of everything, but approximately you'll see how I try to capture my photographs to include the rule of thirds. When we were in Wyoming, we were staying in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and it's a pretty touristy town. So when you go there, you'll notice periodically a pile of cars just on the side of the road because someone noticed some wildlife and someone else noticed that they noticed, and then you'll just end up seeing a lineup of cars. And when you pull over yourself, you see that there's something there, like this moose. So this one day we had rented electric bikes so we could tootle around Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and also go off to some of the nearby towns. And I saw this whole row of cars on the side of the road. So I wanted to run over and see who was there. And there was this moose. And the moose was just quietly drinking water and trying to eat some food with an audience of maybe 30 people watching to the side. So I thought that was pretty funny. Now back to the rule of thirds. How are the rule of thirds in play here? You see that the moose is on the bottom third line. And then everything else, all of the trees and the what coming out of the water and everything in the background, that's all in the upper 2/3. Quick backstory on this photograph. So we were on our way to Wyoming, and our layover was in Chicago at the Chicago airport. And once we got to this section of the airport, I had to take a photo because my family and I remembered that it was the airport from Home Alone. And this is where Kevin and his family were running down to catch their plane. So of course I needed to take a photo. This does have some rule of thirds going on in it. You'll see that those flags are on that upper third line, and the vanishing point, if you think of a train track, if you're standing straight on a train track and the edges of the track as they extend ahead of you, they meet at a point way off into the distance. That's called the vanishing point. So you'll see that that's also on the lower third line. However, this is a great example of using symmetry. I know I said right in the beginning that putting things right in the center of your photograph is normally not a great idea because it's pretty boring. But if you have a symmetrical scene, it's a perfect time to place your subject right in the center of your photograph. Symmetrical patterns or symmetrical scenes help guide the viewer's eye, especially if you're following down a symmetrical path to an endpoint. So everything doesn't have to be an exact mirror image of itself on either half. Like think of a butterfly where the left half is the same as the right half. But, as long as there are similarly sized objects or shapes of objects, then it works perfectly. We're back at Penwood State Park, and this is another view from that gorgeous stopping point of the sky reflecting into the water. But I'm showing this as a great example of symmetry once again. It's just symmetrical top to bottom instead of left to right. So symmetry works either way. It can be top to bottom, left and right, either way, as long as it's kind of a split down the center and it's the same on both halves. That's your idea of using symmetry. Here is an example of asymmetry. So as I said, symmetry is when you have the same on both sides. Asymmetry is when you have something different on either side. So a different visual weight on either side, but it's still balanced. When you're thinking about asymmetry, picture a seesaw. If you have someone who's larger and heavier on one side and someone who's smaller and lighter on the other side, you have to shift where their position is on the seesaw in order to balance it out. Now this is a photograph of Roosevelt Arch. The arch itself is symmetrical, but the actual composition of the photograph is asymmetrical. You see the motorcycle on the left side kind of getting a little bit closer to the middle, and on the right side you see this larger red vehicle that's closer to the edge. So asymmetry having two dissimilar sides but still with a sense of balance. This is commemorating Teddy Roosevelt since he helped to make Yellowstone a national park. We'll continue keeping the rule of thirds in the back of our heads in all of the photographs that we're taking, and I'll point things out as we go along, but we're going to talk about some other things as well. So right now, let's talk about negative space. So space and negative space within your composition can help direct your focus or give a resting place for your eye. So in this photograph, the negative space would be the sky, and the positive space would be the ocean on the bottom and the sun in the sky. And where is that sun? That sun is in the upper right little target point, thinking about a rule of thirds. Also, the sky takes up approximately 2/3 of the photograph, and the ocean takes up the bottom third of the photograph. This is another example of negative space, but instead of the sky being the negative space, the ocean is the negative space. So the ocean takes up the majority of the photograph, and the person, that's my son from a while back, he is on that upper 1/3 line, that dividing line. And as I was talking about earlier with visual weight, you're drawn right to his face, because as humans, if you see another human, especially their face, that's where you directly will look, especially if you can see their eyes. Here's one more example of negative space. So the water, again, is the negative space, and the dock at the bottom is the negative space, and my son is the positive space. So we're looking directly towards his face, because as humans, that's what you do. You look right towards another human's face, and you look towards where his eyes are, which are at the 1/3 dividing line at the bottom. This is a photograph I took when we were on our way to the Roosevelt Arch, which we had seen a few slides earlier. So this is on the west side of Yellowstone National Park. So this is an example of visual weight. So it refers to the hierarchy, which is the importance of the elements in your composition. So in this photograph, I literally took the visual weight as a literal thing because the rocks at the bottom actually look heavier. So they're drawing your eye in at the bottom, and then you follow the river up. So there's literal visual weight within this piece, even though lots of pieces that have, when you think about visual weight, it doesn't necessarily have to be a physically heavy thing. It's kind of a play on that in this one. This is another example of visual weight. First, you see that a person is at that lower target point. So that's my son sitting on the rock, and he's looking out towards the Grand Tetons. His body posture helps direct our eyes towards the mountain, but also because the mountains are so large, we are guided toward that direction as well. Another example of visual weight, you see my son in that similar bottom left point of interest, and his body position is looking out, but what you're also really drawn to is that bright light, that bright reflection on the water. So you're pulled into that. But when you see the figure there and you see his direction, you see he's looking right out at that reflection from the sun. Now for some examples of leading lines. Here we are jumping back to Yellowstone, and we're driving down the road, and here's a bison. So there are bison that you'll see throughout the entire national park, but this one I thought was pretty clever because the bison is in the road as though he's one of the cars. So when we think about leading lines here, you see the lines, the actual painted lines on the road, and they're going from the left corner diagonally towards the right portion of the photograph, and the cars are actually in a line driving in that direction, and the bison is in the line as well. You might also notice the edge of the hill and the mountains in the background, and those are all lines throughout the piece. Shifting back to the ghost town in Colorado I spoke of earlier, we have an example of leading lines here. You see my son at the bottom, and he's on a path that's curving its way up through the photograph towards that upper third area where my husband is standing. So your eye is following that path that's made into the ground, just the dirt path. You see a line and you follow it up. As a side note, it's also showing visual weight where you see the human that you automatically are drawn to at the bottom, and you follow where he's going up the leading line to the human at the top where my husband is. Now for a few examples of scale. So if you are taking into account the size of your subject matters and comparing them against each other, then you can get an idea of how big or small they each are. This photo is showing a view of Snow King Mountain in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. We had rented bikes for the day and mountain biked around. And this is a good example of showing scale because you can see me as an average sized person compared to this giant mountain. So using something like a human, which we all know what humans look like and we know approximately how large a human is, if you use a human as your indicator of scale compared to something as large as a mountain, then you can really get a feel for how big that mountain actually is. This is another photograph in Yellowstone National Park when we were on our way to the Roosevelt Arches. And this was a terrifying, treacherous drive. You see that there are no guardrails anywhere, and it's a pretty far drop. So I was on the verge of a panic attack the entire time. But this is a great indicator of scale because if you look on the road, you'll see a camper, like a truck camper thing, and you see the car and see how tiny they look compared to the really large mountains and cliff sides. And our last example of scale is showing the elk antler arch, which is found in the center of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. So these antler arches we found them throughout Jackson Hole. We even passed by one when we first landed. Our plane landed in the airport, and they're fully made up of shed antlers. So the elks shed them in the spring, and the local Boy Scouts will collect them and sell them to tourists to raise money for the elk preserve. So you can just see how huge this arch is because I'm standing beneath it with my son, and the arch is more than double the height of us, and you can just see all of those antlers packed in there to build up this arch. Now for some examples of cropping or framing. So the idea behind cropping is that it helps to get rid of a busy or distracting background or surrounding, and it helps to keep your focus on your main subject. You can also fill your frame with your subject, and it's pretty neat when you're using patterns in your photograph. Also, you want to make sure you pay attention to whether you're unintentionally chopping off limbs when you're cropping your image, because that will make your subject look kind of strange. With framing, you can think of it as something that's surrounding your main subject so that your attention is drawn towards that. When I think of framing, I think of an actual frame, a picture frame, like a metal or wood frame that would surround your drawing or painting or photograph. So instead of having a frame around your photograph, you're thinking about the framing within your photograph, something along the edges maybe that help direct your eye towards your subject that's within that frame. This is a photograph at the Grand Tetons of Jenny Lake, and the Tetons in the background in the morning, so early morning sun, and it's an example of cropping and framing. So it's cropping and framing because you have a branch coming out from a tree and you don't see the rest of the tree. The trunk and all of the other branches were cropped out, but it's framing the mountain towards the right. So those branches are literally framing the top, left, and bottom edging of the mountain and its reflection in the water. Now for a photo of my cute pup, Wicket. Wicket with a T. So this is a good example of cropping because you just see his face. The rest of his body is cropped out of the photo. And where are his eyes? His eyes are on the upper third line. This is an example of cropping because I have gotten rid of the entire distracting background so that I can focus mainly on the bright pink lily. This is actually the airport in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The airport is in the Grand Tetons National Park, which is pretty amazing. So I felt like I was a rock star getting off of the plane when we first landed in Wyoming. And this photo, I wanted to get one final photo before we had to fly home from our amazing vacation in Wyoming. So I had to take a view of the Grand Tetons in the background with our plane in front of it. You can see how I used cropping here because there's a huge portion of the plane that you're not seeing, but I wanted to keep the engine and part of the wing in the background so that that is the main thing that you're focused on, with the mountain kind of softly in the background. Here was a stop off in Yellowstone National Park at the Yellowstone Canyon, and it's named after the Yellowstones, but it's an example of framing. You see the trees on the left side and the right side framing the actual Yellowstone Canyon. Here's my dog again looking at me as he's sitting on the stairs heading down to our basement, and he's surrounded by the slats that are attached to the stairs. On our drive through Yellowstone, you can see that the road and the mountains are being framed by the trees on the left and the right side, arching over the road. Now we'll see some examples of how pattern or texture are used to create interest in our compositions. You'll be seeing some more examples of some of the crazy things in Yellowstone National Park, but to start, here is some runoff from geothermal activity. So the geothermal activity in Yellowstone is because Yellowstone is actually located on a continental divide. On this continental divide, there was a lot of volcanic activity long ago, and it created mountains, and it's also still active, so that causes geysers, hot springs, mud pots, bubbling mud, all that kind of stuff. And so this is one of the things that's a result of that. This runoff is caused from hot water that came out of the ground, and it's the dried minerals that are left behind. So you can see all of the texture throughout the entire photograph, but you can also see the repetition of the runoff from left to right. This is a photograph I took of rows of tulips at Elizabeth Park in Hartford, Connecticut. You can see the texture of the grass, of the fencing, of the dirt, of the flowers, all that, but you also have the pattern, the repetition of the flowers alternating from the pink to the green to the brown. This is a snapshot from our hike in Colorado by the ghost town, and I thought it was interesting because of all the little branches coming off of the tree, all the little twigs. So it just looks really rough and sharp, and that's all just texture and kind of the repetition of the lines throughout the whole thing as well. Here's a photo of my unhappy dog sitting wet after going for his very first swim in a lake when we discovered that he hates swimming. You can tell from the texture of his fur that he's wet. He's not a soft, fluffy dog. So you see the texture through that on his body, on his fur. And then you can also see the pattern on the ground from the sun going through the leaves above him. Now let's talk about color. You can add interest in your photos by having an interesting color combination or having a color that really pops. I thought this was a good example of color because in Yellowstone, when you come across all the families of bison, you see all of these gigantic, beautiful brown bison. But all of a sudden, I saw this small orange bison, this little baby bison among its family of large bison. So just seeing that orange was very eye-catching, especially in a field of green grass and large dark brown bison. This was some type of red bell flower that I saw on a hike when I was in Colorado, and the red of the flower really pops against the green background, especially because the green background is not in focus and the red is in sharp focus. This is the Grand Prismatic Spring. It's a hot spring in Yellowstone National Park, and it's caused by the geothermal activity below the earth that I spoke of earlier. And each of the various colors are caused from the various types of microorganisms or bacteria that thrive in the extreme heat of the spring. Each of the rings create a very different environment, and it's lived in by different types of the bacteria. Where it's really hot and less inhabitable in the very center, it's this dark blue, and it cools little by little as it gets toward the outer ring. It's actually the different types of bacteria that give the spring its prismatic colors. Now let's talk about how to use your light sources to work for your intention. We're going to take a tour through Yellowstone National Park and the Grand Tetons in one day. So it'll be 2 different days worth all jammed into one, starting from very early in the morning to late at night. We decided that our first full day in Wyoming would be at the Grand Tetons. Since Wyoming is a couple of hours behind Connecticut, we were up super early and thought that this would be the perfect time to watch the sunrise. So we were up at about 5 o'clock, maybe a little earlier than that, and we started on our drive to the Grand Tetons. It was pitch black out when we left our hotel, but on our way, we could see the sun kind of starting to rise up a little bit. So here, our very first photo, you see a slight bit of the sunrise, but most of the light is from our car headlights. Once we made it to the parking lot of the Grand Tetons, the sun was starting to rise a bit more. So it's about 5:45 here, and you can see the sun coming up a little bit above the mountains. You see a slight glow. You'll also notice that the moon is in the upper right corner by one of the target points in the Rule of Thirds guideline, and it's surrounded by a lot of negative space. So I am revisiting the compositional guidelines that I mentioned earlier throughout these photos coming up as well. Now that we're in the Grand Teton National Park, we started our hike and we are at Jenny Lake. It is 6:30 a.m. and the sun is rising. Take notice of how the water looks at this time of day. It's still pretty dark out, so you can't really make out much through the water, and you can compare this to some of the later photos throughout the day. This photo was only taken 5 minutes after the previous photo was taken. It's already much brighter. The light is shining across the mountains, and you can see that they are painted pink from the sunlight. It's about 9 a.m. now, and you can see that the sun is much higher in the sky, shining down on the water. The water has this giant white glare from the sun across it, and the water is much bluer than it was earlier. This is a photo taken from Inspiration Point at the Grand Tetons. We had hiked up from where the last photo was taken, and now we had this really great view of Jenny Lake from this vantage point. We're now a couple of hours later at about noontime, and you can see how much bluer the water really is. It looks almost aqua, and you can see through to the rocks at the bottom where it's a bit shallower. So at this time of day, the sun is actually letting you see through the water a bit. So now we've jumped over to Yellowstone National Park to the Mammoth Hot Springs. So this is about 4:30 p.m. and if you see the white on the rock here, you might think it looks like snow, but it's actually calcium carbonate deposits, and it's from the heated water that has risen to the surface, and that's all that's left behind. We're still at Mammoth Hot Springs. This is just a different view, but you can see the deep shadows that are created from the sun at this time of day, and the huge clouds are in the sky, but you can still make out all of the detail on the ground. It's still pretty bright out, so you can see everything very clearly on the ground. You see the orange and the bright white of the calcium carbonate. It's about 6 p.m. here at Yellowstone Canyon, and you can see the deep shadows caused by the placement of the sun across the canyon here. This is another hot spring at Yellowstone, and this one is called the Warm Spring Basin. This photo was taken at 7:30 p.m. This time of day is pre-sunset, and it's called the golden hour. So you can get some really beautiful photos here when the sun is getting ready to set. And it is a time of day when things look kind of spooky and pretty cool. You'll also notice some of the steam coming out from the water and some of the bubbles across. This is only 8 minutes after the photograph in the last slide, and it's already looking much darker and much spookier. Look at all that steam. Crazy. Visiting the hot springs, especially when it's during the golden hour, makes it look really spooky, and you feel like you're maybe on a different planet. And it's now 9:20 p.m. on our treacherous drive back through Yellowstone National Park, heading back to Jackson Hole where we were staying. It's extremely dark and there are no lights on the road, only your headlights from your car. It's also pretty terrifying because you know that on one side of the road there's a giant drop off and lots of mountains and rocks below. Now let's look at some examples of directional natural lighting. This photo was taken while we were on a whale watch in Cape Cod, and looking out towards the boat ahead, we see that the sun is not quite in an ideal position to be able to get all of the detail of the boat. So where is the sun here? If we're keeping it general and thinking about backlighting versus front lighting, this would be backlighting. So the sun is behind the boat, in which case we can't really make out much of the detail of the boat. The boat looks pretty dark. Here's another example of backlighting. When we were on our hike through the Grand Tetons, this was about 10:30 a.m. and we came across this moose. And I couldn't get a photo of the moose in detail at all. He's just in silhouette, and that's because the sun is behind him. What about in this photo? Where do you think the sun is? Considering how bright the sun is on my son's face in this photo, so much so that he can't even open his eyes, this is an example of front lighting. When your subject is front lit, yes, your subject might be blinded by the sun, but you can actually make out all of the detail on their face and their clothing. We wanted to take a photo at our halfway point of our 11-mile hike at the Grand Tetons. And so in order for us to not just be completely covered in shadows, we had to be positioned so that the sun was in front of us. Late morning, afternoon sun can be tough for taking photos, but if you're trying to get the detail and see faces without shadows, then having the sun positioned in front of your subjects makes it a little bit easier. Early morning and evening photo shoots, or even overcast, can be a little bit easier so you're not blinded by the sun. So as a general guide, keep in mind the difference between front lighting in this photo versus backlighting in this photo, and where you can see more of your detail in your subjects without the harsh shadows. Now for sun coming from other directions, this is an example of side light. You can see that the sun is on the left side of the photo, and besides seeing the bright white on the water and that lens flare on the left side, you can also see that the shadows from the trees and the rocks are actually on the right side of those objects, and they're more lit up on the left side. And here's a photo of my dog giving me side eye. You can see that the sun is coming from the right side of the photo here, and you can see the shadows created on the left side. The left side of his body is much darker, and you see the shadow, the cast shadow, onto the ground to the left side. The sun is kind of spread throughout the room here. It's not coming from any specific direction, and this is an example of indirect light. And here you can see my dog in all of his floofy glory, and you see him spotlit from the sun. And for an example of controlled light sources. So this is using indoor lighting or studio lighting that you can control the direction the light is going in. So for a little fun, I made this still life setup with these miniature skeletons and a Triceratops skeleton. You can see the lamp is shining from the center up, so it's really bright on the belly of the Triceratops, and then you can see on the tops it's more in shadow. Here the lamp is shining from the left side up. The light is now on the opposite side, the right side shining up, so you see the tail is all lit up, and the other foot is a little more lit up, and his left side of the skeletons and the Triceratops are more in shadow. Here you see the lamp shining from a higher height from the left side down, and again from the right side down. And now the light is shining from a higher height top down, so everything is mainly lit up with the belly more in shadow. So do you remember how the backlighting and front lighting affected the subject in some of my earlier photos? Instead of front lighting or backlighting, this is side lighting, where you can see the right side of everything is lit up and the left side is in shadow. But you could also notice the little triangle of light beneath the skeleton's eye on that lower left area. This harsh side lighting is also known as Rembrandt lighting. You may have heard of Rembrandt, the Dutch artist from the 1600s, before, and he used this lighting technique in his works of art. Rembrandt lighting is known for the illuminated triangle under the eye of the subject on the darker shadowed side. And the last example we'll have for lighting is the camera flash. This photo was taken in a mirror maze at a science museum, and it was very hard to get good lighting, so I needed to use my camera flash in here. Ideally, you would not have your flash directed in a mirror, but considering there were mirrors all over the place, I couldn't really avoid that. It was coming from every different angle, but it helped me to illuminate my son's face. The room was in complete darkness, but I wanted to have a photo of my dog all snuggled up underneath the blankets, so I used a camera flash here to be able to light him up for this photograph. Now for a quick run through of content and themes. This is going to help give you some ideas for what you can focus on in your photos. A common theme in photography is landscape. This is a view of Lamar Valley before sunset, and this is where the wolves are found to be roaming around. Here's another view of Lamar Valley when the sun is beginning to set during the golden hour. Nature photos. Here's a photograph of Yellowstone Canyon, and it makes me wonder how deep that dark center of the canyon is and what is down there. Nature again, but with a focus on flowers. Many people love taking photos of flowers, some that are just growing in their gardens or that they're growing in flower pots, and others that they come across in the wild. Animals. These were some of the horses we met at a ranch in Wyoming when we went on our horseback mountain tour. Modeling photos. I have a screen printing business where I print my designs on t-shirts, and here is my sister who is my model for my shirts. Architecture. This is the Welcome Center at Mystic Seaport. Interiors. This is an interior of one of the old houses you can visit at Mystic Seaport. Still life. Still life photography can incorporate a number of things. Typically, you think of still life photography being focused on inanimate objects that are typically either natural or man-made. So this could include flowers, shells, rocks, food, dishware, or product photography. So you'll see that something like a flower could be an example of still life photography or nature photography. We see plenty of photos taken of food. This is another example of still life photography. Portraiture. As we see here, portraiture doesn't necessarily have to mean your subject is human. Here, my subject is my adorable little dog. Sports and action. This was taken at a rodeo in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And a photo of bison running by us at Yellowstone National Park. Journalism and reportage. Remember when all of the shelves were bare at the grocery store during the height of the pandemic? Lastly is storytelling. So this is creating a timeline or setting a scene for a specific scenario. See if you can figure out what the following two photos are showing. Any guess what the story here might be? If you guessed that these fireworks were for the 4th of July, then you would be correct. And this final photo is showing a goalie trying to protect his net from a goal being scored on him. This is everything we've discussed in this slideshow. I hope you've picked up some helpful guidelines when taking your own photos.